One of the reasons Gary and I opened Daniel Davis Deep Dive and why we started this show is because we were really frustrated when we were watching mainstream news, whether it's print or television journalism, that they seem to only have one side of a story. If you wanted to see one side of something, you might go into CNN or MSNBC. If you wanted to see a different side, you go to Fox or One America News, et cetera, something like that. And you got two very different versions, but neither one of them would really give the whole story. So we wanted to do that with this show, and of course do a deep dive, meaning more than just a 45-second soundbite opportunity, to where you can actually get into some depth and understand a situation here. And one of the hallmarks of the show that we've really set out from doing is we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is. And oftentimes we are kind of accused of being from a pro-Russian bias. We're not. We're a pro-truth bias. And that's what we center on. And we have been showing you a number of people. We showed you a couple, one American that fought on the side of Ukraine, and then we've shown you a couple of British folks and some others who have fought on the Russian side, and an American for that matter. But now for the first time, we have a Ukrainian journalist, Francis Farrell from the Kiev Independent, who is a frontline reporter. And I am super excited to have Francis on the show today. And so first of all, Francis, just welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here. Excited for an interesting conversation.
And I wonder if you can tell a lot of our folks who may not know you. I know a lot of them are going to, because they follow your work at the Kiev Independent. We use the headlines from their newspaper a lot on our show. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit about who you are. And I understand that the Kiev Independent used to be, or there used to be the Kiev Post, and then there started the Kiev Independent. And I wonder if you could just talk just real briefly about how that happened and the organization and what you do.
Yeah, I guess I can start with that. For those who don't know, the Kiev Independent was actually founded just 3 months before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the team that used to be the editorial team of the Kiev Post, which was this flagship English language media in Ukraine since Ukraine became independent back in the 90s. And as some of you might have heard, I mean, it happens in many countries that the big rich owners of media try to use it for political purposes, and the same thing goes in Ukraine. And the new owner who owns the Kiev Post wanted to pressure the editorial team to be a bit nicer to the leadership of the country. And this is an editorial team which had a lot of experience and strong values with investigative journalism. And they refused. They said, no, editorial independence is important for us. And so in November 2001, he came in and fired the entire newsroom, shut down the paper, and he restarted it, but said, you have to work along our rules at this point. And the whole team refused, and they went forward and started the very aptly named Kiev Independent, which had just enough time to really establish itself as the more trustworthy and more professional English language media coming out of Ukraine, so that when the full-scale invasion did actually happen, people got on board more behind that, even though the Kiev Post was restarted. And I think it's important, for people to understand here that, you know, there are really no billionaires behind the Kiev Independent. And it's certainly, I think there's sometimes a misconception that it is a Ukrainian state-owned media, and that everything we write, we put forward in front of Zelensky to check before it comes out. But if you have a look, you know, we don't hold back with our criticism sometimes of the leadership. I've written about issues with the military leadership. I've asked Zelensky myself very critical questions at press conferences. We report on the good and the bad. And over time, you know, even though the initial hype wave of the beginning of the full-scale war has definitely died down, there's this idea of Ukraine fatigue all across the world. We have been able to grow the community of people who regularly support us with a monthly donation. We don't have a paywall, so it's those monthly donations that keep us going, and we've been able to grow. We've got our own YouTube channel now, and yeah, we're just going up and up. I haven't personally been with the Kiev Independent from the very start, but close to the start. I joined in summer 22. If you'll notice, I'm not actually Ukrainian by birth. I've got an Australian accent and and not a very Ukrainian name. So I'm from Australia originally, but ever since university, I have focused on this region, the post-Soviet region, Russian politics, Ukrainian politics, the geopolitics of the region. I speak fluent Ukrainian and Russian, and yeah, when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, having lived in Ukraine a little bit before, I understood that this is for real. A large country is trying to swallow up a small country in the first time we've really seen that in Europe, or almost anywhere in the world since World War II. And I have to do something, and it seemed like this is the best way to communicate what's going on from a Ukrainian voice, but to do so to the outside world. And
So,
since then,
so I'm curious, how do you balance, I guess, accurate reporting, which may be deemed negative, towards and especially if the truth is something that's not attractive to the administration, do you balance out telling the truth like it is, but not risking angering them too much? Because at least from what we've read on the outside, there was a number of Ukrainian media that was silenced because they were too far away from what the government wanted. Have you ever run into that situation?
I mean, I think I would say that there's a big difference between an administration in wartime, which has some quite clumsy and tactful and not really correct attitudes to the media, thinking that any corruption investigation is a real pain, and trying to surveil media and so on, comparing that to an actual dictatorship where just for the word war, you can be jailed or killed. Or exiled. Ukraine is still it's in a tricky position, obviously, because martial law prohibits elections from being happening, and that makes sense because elections would tear apart the country from the inside when the country is under an existential threat. But at the same time, press freedom compared to a real authoritarian country is still solid in Ukraine. There are moments when someone publishes a more critical piece, and the administration gets a bit upset, and they try and limit their access to the military or something like that. I haven't had any problems personally, and I've written some very critical pieces of the top military leadership in Ukraine, and it hasn't been a problem for me to continue working with the military in the field, because again, Ukraine's interest and the leadership's interests are sometimes not always aligning. There is internal political games at play, and but on the whole, we're still able to operate in a pretty free environment.
And you mentioned the issue of elections. What do you say to those, even some in the Western Europe, that, well, he went past his term, Zelensky went past his term of service. He isn't even attempting to have an election, and he can't just go on literally forever. Is there any discussion about how long can this go on, especially if the war is either going to end in negotiated settlement on the current line of contact or something short of that? So at some point, there's going to have to be one. But what is that point, and how is it viewed inside of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, all countries have most countries, especially democracies, have a constitution according to how they work, that sets out these rules, and that within that constitution are all the rules concerning martial law. And the same goes for the conduct of elections under martial law. So officially, you would have to change the constitution. That would need to have a referendum for that to even happen. And there are huge issues. There are huge issues with millions of Ukrainians under occupation, over 1 million Ukrainians fighting, millions of Ukrainians abroad, and of course the safety of polling places, and everything is happening. I mean, it's interesting how like things like negotiated settlement and freezing the contact line, things like that are thrown around when in reality we see absolutely no evidence that Russia is at all interested in stopping its advance onto Ukraine and its attempt to end the idea of a sovereign democratic Ukraine in the first place. And so when that is the real existential threat that has not gone away, and so many Ukrainians have already died and continue to fight for these basic freedoms, then
So do the people in Ukraine, how
priority.
long would they go? I mean, would it live? I mean, if it's years, multiple, they'll be content with Zelensky just continuing on from the previous one. I mean, how long would it go before people would go, yeah, we really need to do an election?
While this threat is present, and while Russia continues to advance as it is now, you don't hear Ukrainians calling
Okay,
for elections right now.
fair enough. Let's move on to you mentioned also Zelensky, that you have interviewed him several times or asked him questions or so. What is your assessment of Zelensky? Because he's viewed in some quarters of the United States, especially after that disastrous Oval Office meeting in February, where he got into an argument with the president and the vice president. Some say, well, he's too obstinate and he doesn't want to listen to anything the West says, and he only wants more stuff or whatever. What he views is he doesn't want to have a negotiated settlement on terms that are realistic. And so he keeps going down another path. What is your impression from Zelensky, I guess, from the time you've seen him even before the war? Have you seen any changes of him, and how do you see him now?
I mean, I think there are different Zelenskys to look at. There's Zelensky, the wartime leader, which I think most people have been very impressed with from the start, although there have been, moments of slipping up. And I think potentially the way he's tried to engage with Trump at first, especially in the Oval Office, has not been the smartest necessarily diplomatically. But on the other hand, it's interesting to see that his public support, for example, inside Ukraine, which had, it had been dropping bit by bit as the exhaustion of the war was like catching up to Ukrainian people, the pressure, the internal pressure of mobilization. And it just shot back up after that Oval Office meeting, even though the result of it, the cutting off of aid and intelligence, was really bad. And it just says a little bit about how important dignity and pride is for the Ukrainian people in the face of Russia, in the face of people like Donald Trump, who think that the country can just be pushed around. And but that's Zelensky as a wartime leader. That's Zelensky as a symbol. If you look at how he's governed inside Ukraine, obviously there are questions to be asked, as they are of almost any leader. I have, my own gripes with him, especially, with regard to the military leadership, which he, as Supreme Commander-in-Chief, is primarily responsible for taking care of. But on the whole, I think at the moment, if you did have magically had free and fair elections in Ukraine in wartime, he would win. There's no doubt about that. There's no alternative at the moment in this political landscape who the Ukrainian people would trust with taking over this struggle.
Well, speaking of the people in Zelensky, let me see how to characterize the question I'm thinking of here. Has there been any change in what the people think of him? Because over time, so let's say toward the end of 2022, when Ukraine had its two signature victories in the Kharkiv area and in the Kherson province by forcing Russia out of Kherson City. Obviously, huge success and victory there. I mean, he was riding high. That's one of the big Russian pushback. But then after that, he started promising that he was going to push Russia all the way back to the 1991 borders. With the 2023 offensive, he really was emphatic that they were going to succeed and win, et cetera. Then, of course, it turned out quite differently. The UAF broke their teeth on that first line of the Surovikin line, and then they've been pushed back ever since then. And now that instead of talking about going to the 1991 borders, he's just talking about having a negotiated settlement on terms that he is okay with, but which at the very best are going to be along the current line of contact, meaning even though he's de facto say I'm not going to acknowledge it, but we know we're going to lose it. So how do the people go when, all right, you were telling me we're going to 1991 and now you're telling me the best case is we're only going to lose the current line of contact? Do they see a problem with that?
To be honest, yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, there has been that shift in realization of what's possible. And I don't think the Ukrainians necessarily blame Zelensky for this realization now that going forward and liberating Crimea is not realistic. In fact, the real realization was a little bit different, if I may say. It was actually more that people were a little bit frustrated for a while that his language of only accepting going forward until victory didn't seem to correspond to the reality of what we were looking at post-counteroffensive, which was Russia going forward. And as I mentioned, over 2023 and 4 especially, as the war just grinded on and it seemed like it was more going in Russia's favor at this point, that's when things like especially mobilization start to take their toll as the biggest internal source of pain in a country like Ukraine. But that was where you see on social media, some people perhaps were saying, can't you just come to the table and negotiate? Instead of chasing total victory. But then that was when that shift happened with Trump arriving, because people once again understood that it's not about a magical peace deal and total victory. It's about making Ukraine fight the strongest possible, because the thing we're still dealing with is Russia's attempt to annihilate this country as an independent sovereign nation in the first place. And when people had a bit of hope when Trump arrived, they thought, okay, he's a tough guy, he wants peace more than anything, and that's what we want too. Ukrainians want peace, and so he will understand that, okay, yes, Ukraine might not get their territory back immediately. They might not even be able to get some kind of rock solid security guarantee. But one thing Trump will be able to do is to stop Russia where they are. And unfortunately, we've seen that even though Ukraine, since the Oval Office meeting, has almost done everything right on the diplomatic stage, they've put forward a simple, unconditional 30-day ceasefire and say, we're just willing to stop. We want to stop the fighting. We're listening to your language, President Trump, and we're ready to work with you on a minerals deal. But when Russia wants to still go forward, and when Russia wants so much more of Ukraine, they started with an attack on Kyiv. It's been a great way to show that it's Russia that doesn't want peace. But unfortunately, we're not seeing any will from President Trump to actually push Russia to stop.
Yeah. And of course, and I think a good reason for that is because he realizes we don't have the leverage to force Russia into anything anyway, because some are certainly trying. You talked about some of the negotiation issues here. Is there any concern, I guess, among the Ukrainian people, if you look back to the March, April 2022 negotiations in Istanbul, and at that time, Russia was basically saying you would have to surrender not just, of course, Crimea was for them always off the table, but Luhansk and Donetsk only. and then there would be some sort of confederation, and then the Russians would leave or whatever. That deal, as compared to the one that's being offered now with this current 12-point plan, is night and day difference. And is there any concern in Ukraine that, hang on, you didn't take this deal we had that would have only surrendered 2 provinces before? Now that it's been years later and some huge number of Ukrainian people have been killed, and now we're going to settle for something that's worse than what we could have had back then. Is that something that people consider and ask questions about?
To be honest, not really. First of all, everyone in Ukraine throughout their history, if anyone knows Ukrainian history even a little bit, understands that Russia does not negotiate in good faith. And nothing that they sign, if it doesn't come backed with a hard advantage in balance of power for Ukraine, or hard security guarantees, nothing that Russia signs on a piece of paper really matters at all. They exist in a completely amoral post-truth environment in which they can say, no, we have to come in again. There are some more Russian speakers that we need to defend. Too bad. That they were saying at the very last days before the invasion that they wouldn't invade. The whole Minsk agreements were based on a completely false premise that Russia was not involved at all in the so-called separatist republics, that they were actually coordinating from the start, which we know very well.
And what do you say to those folks that say, well, actually, it was the Ukraine side that didn't keep the Minsk agreements, especially the requirement to change the constitution to give some independence to the Russian-speaking Eastern countries or whatever, which obviously never happened in the Minsk agreements, which was required. How do you answer that question?
Well, I mean, the Minsk agreements were set up for failure from the start. Again, Russia was pretending not to be part of the treaty of these separatist states, and Ukraine was basically forced in to sign them after 2 big battlefield defeats, one in mid-2014 and one in February 2015, which ironically both involved the regular Russian army crossing the border and fighting against Ukraine. So they were signed obviously under duress, and Russia had and part of the Minsk agreements, which Russia didn't ever consider actually following, was the removal of foreign fighter contingents and the restoral of Ukrainian control over their border. So they were a temporary solution to please the international community, but they had really no basis in reality as a way of actually resolving the conflict.
So you say that it was signed under duress. Does that imply then that the regime, and I don't remember who was president at the time, never intended to actually accomplish those things, specifically the change in the Constitution?
It wouldn't have been possible without at the same time Russia actually removing its occupation of those regions. No.
Okay, and of course Russia's saying the opposite, that their removal of the contingents was based upon this. So you had this dynamic that I guess neither side was going to budge on the central issue that each side wanted. And then
Russia was denying that they were involved in those republics in the first place, right? Which was a complete lie. So it's again, when you're talking about agreements and treaties against a country that for which the truth just does not matter, it's pretty tough. And when it comes to Istanbul, again, I think another thing that is really not talked about in Istanbul is the idea of territory. Because people, I mean,
I'm sorry, you're talking 2022 Istanbul or the current?
Yeah,
Istanbul?
2022. So
Okay.
if we talk about April 2022, I mean, and when those talks were happening, it's important to revisit what areas were actually occupied then. Russia had a very good foothold on the western bank of the Dnieper River. They were occupying Kherson. They were occupying basically as much of Zaporizhia Oblast as they're occupying now. They still hadn't finished
taking Mariupol, and they were still pretty much on the outskirts of Kharkiv. And again, if you look at history of the Soviet Union and the conflicts that Russia has been involved in since then, once they occupy a place, they simply don't withdraw from it. And so, the idea that they were really close to a deal, and that Russia was going to magically withdraw from those areas while Ukraine would give them all of Donetsk and Luhansk, and again, a reminder that this all fell apart after the Bucha massacre came to light outside Kiev. It's just very far from reality that they were close to a deal.
Interesting. All right, let's move to the tactical operation here. So that's all playing out and continues to be playing out at the diplomatic and international level. But everything depends on what happens at the tactical level, because you can have all the decisions and all the ideas in the world you want to happen, but if you can't make it appear on the battlefield, then your hand is going to be weakened, whichever side you're talking about here. I know you did a video recently that I thought was just excellent on drones. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but then about some other issues specifically on the front line that has to do with fighting. So first of all, kind of how have you seen, if you could just kind of generally characterize it, the production of drones and the current fighting and how it plays into what I've discovered so far. People that I've talked to on both sides of the line say this is the one area of the war so far that is basically a parity. Nobody has an advantage one way or the other, except for some Russians have said that the technical capacity is actually an advantage still on the Ukraine side. How do you see it?
Yeah, so if we look at the timeline of the war, the way the war that was being fought 2 years ago, for example, around the end of the Battle of Bakhmut and the beginning of the counteroffensive, is completely different from what it is now. And when I talk to people in different countries, militaries and diplomats, that the one thing I just need to hammer home over and over again is that now on the battlefield in Ukraine, and this is a development that hasn't happened anywhere else in any other war, and it's only happened in the last few years, is that in every hot section of the front line, and almost in any section of the front line at all, going back a depth of up to 5 kilometers and then more and more these days, we now have a battlefield where anything that moves, whether it's a vehicle or just one individual soldier, anything that moves can be targeted by multiple high precision, incredibly cheap weapons within the space of a few minutes. If we compare that even to what this war looked like at the start or during the Battle of Bakhmut, where the king was still artillery, and you need to first find a target, then shoot a big artillery gun at it, and then correct fire until you hit on your third or fourth or fifth attempt. Now it's within a few minutes, each soldier or vehicle is being hunted by very precise weapons that each cost as little as the 10th of the price of one artillery shell. That's the first thing that needs to understand, that we need to understand. So we have conditions of saturation of high precision strike drones, and on top of the famous FPVs, which fly straight into the target, we do also have the bomber drones. And on top of that, we have distance mining, which is playing a very important part in some of the battles. And this saturation, this overall condition of saturation, is there on both sides. So in different places, it might be more on one side than the other, but overall, this zone of 5 to 10 kilometers back or more these days from the zero line is basically almost as deadly, just as deadly as it is on one side as it is on the other, which means that for both sides, getting logistics, getting men, supplies, especially when we're talking about infantry, up to that zero line, is just getting deadlier and deadlier. What that means on the Ukrainian defensive side, because you could call it parity in many areas, but it's also not parity in the sense that one side is attacking and one side is defending. And so on the defending side, you can really tell the difference in the experience of each side's infantry. On the defensive side, the infantry has to hike for a long way just to get to the positions, and that trip, they usually wait for bad weather, or the time between night and day to make that trip, and it's still very deadly. And of course, then logistics gets deadlier. The evacuation of casualties gets deadlier, and that's how the defensive side mostly suffers from attrition. But on the attacking Russian side, they have this huge supply of truly expendable one-way infantrymen, which they use for their assaults. And so, but it's extremely deadly for them as well, just to get up to that front line. And, there are many parts of the front line where the fighting has been extremely intense, and there have been regular assaults on the Russian side, but almost every single time that whole assault is being eliminated by Ukrainian drone teams backed by artillery before they even make it anywhere near the zero line. The problem is, of course, that when they do make it, and now they're using motorbikes pretty well for this purpose, then it becomes very difficult to dislodge them and fight them off, because the Ukrainian infantry is also so thinly spread and keeping their head down. And so we're seeing this saturation on both sides, and sometimes parity. Sometimes it seems like the Ukrainians come up with smarter technical solutions, but then the Russians copy it in a few weeks and upscale it. And we can talk about this as well.
Yeah.
But when it comes to fiber-optic drones, it was the Russians who really had the head start, and that head start is unfortunately really being felt on the front line at the moment. But what yeah, go on.
Yeah, I want to shift over to the issue you mentioned a couple of times here just right now, is artillery. You said that artillery has lessened in its primacy, I guess, even from Bakhmut to today, but apparently it still has an effect on the front line. How would you characterize, first of all, just the I guess the importance of artillery compared to where it was, say, at Bakhmut, but then secondly, and that is important, does Russia still have a significant advantage in artillery?
Yeah, so artillery as a useful source of firepower hasn't gone anywhere, and there are certainly instances where you'd much prefer to have a high supply of artillery shells and a few good crews, especially if they're working on 155 millimeter NATO standard howitzers. Maybe that there are times when that's preferable to using drones. If we're talking about thick vegetation where the drones can't see or reach a target, if we're talking about some kind of stronger cover where there's no direct way for drones to fly in, it's always a useful source of firepower. But the big shift that has happened is that it's no longer the main way in which enemy Russian targets moving forward are.
And there was a time when it was claimed that Russia had, depending on where on the front you were, anywhere from a 3 to a 5 time advantage. And this is, again, like a couple of years back. How would you characterize that disparity today?
Yeah, so I remember very clearly, I think the worst time was early 2024. Understandable why, because that's when the next aid package from Congress was being held up, and the supply of especially US-made shells was really slowing down, and Europe was very slow to up their production. This Czech initiative hadn't started yet. And it's interesting because that time in early 2024 was actually the catalyst for Ukraine to understand that we need to ramp up the production and the use on the front line of combat FPV strike drones, because otherwise we simply have no way of stopping these Russian offensives at distance. And I remember I was in around Avdiivka around that winter, and I was at a field hospital where the medics were telling me at the time, and because Russia was also upping their drone use, that at the time it was about 50-50 in terms of the wounded coming in, whether they were getting wounds from drones or artillery shells. And even the 50-50 number at the time was really going against the wisdom that drones are interesting, but they will always just be a complement to artillery. By now, if you go to a field hospital, like when I did 2 months ago, it's about 90% of the wounded are coming in with wounds from drones. It just is it's a real cosmic shift, and it's one that Western militaries are certainly not ready for.
Right. Yeah. I'm firmly in agreement with you on that one. So does that imply that the disparity and the increase or not increase, but the superiority of firepower on the on artillery from Russian side, maybe it is 3-1, but maybe it doesn't matter that much anymore because the proliferation of drones is what's actually causing the casualties. Is that accurate?
I mean, it's felt when there is a serious a serious disparity. It was felt really bad when, again, back in early 2024, and it is being felt a little bit more now. I think over the last winter and autumn, things were quite tough for Ukraine, but at the time they still had a lot of artillery shells coming in, and now we've heard more reports that they're having to ration them again now because the U.S. supply is starting to dwindle. And but the Russians are also have made that same shift now. They're producing artillery shells at some kind of rate, but they've had to get millions in from North Korea as well, and it's always an extra bit of firepower that's useful for whoever has it, but the battlefield now is first and foremost dominated by this saturation of drones on both sides.
Got it. Totally makes sense. Now, the third question on the tactics I want to ask, which is one of the things I point out here. I've got 4 combat deployments myself, and I was trained in an armored cavalry squadron for the U.S. 1st Armored Division in the early 2000s. So I have a pretty good idea about how combat is done and what's important, and it always comes down to manpower. You can have all the machines and money you want, but if you don't have the men to use them, and this is actually what one of our viewers here talked about, you've got to have soldiers on the ground, and that seems to be the biggest Achilles heel that I can see so far with the Ukraine side, because I mean, just looking at the demographic maps between the two countries, there's millions more over on the Russian side than on the Ukraine side, and it seems that, at least from what I've been able to report or read, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong, but I don't remember if it was Budanov or Sersky one a few months back said that we can't even mobilize enough people to offset the losses. So there was a net loss in the size and the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces in terms of the number of people. And obviously that's going to be a real problem. So I guess the real question is, how would you consider the manpower dynamic? And I'm talking about, like, say, over the last 6 months to today, and where's it going?
Yeah, so it's not been any kind of secret that that's been Ukraine's biggest issue. Analysts are saying it, commanders are saying it. Doesn't matter how they feel or anything. Everyone understands that manpower has been the biggest issue, especially combat effective manpower. And I'll also add to that, we're really talking about the infantry here. It's until recently, when drones have started to fly deeper and deeper behind the front line. If you're in an artillery crew or a drone crew, or you're a medic going back and forth, of course they take losses as well. But numbers wise, it's a much safer place to be back. And I've talked to whole artillery crews and drone crews who've had 0 KIAs during the whole the whole 3 years of war. Whereas for infantry, it is by far the deadliest, the most miserable job you can have in this war. In many ways, yeah, it's like World War One, but levels more miserable, because
Wow. Saying so.
because even putting up your head out of the ground, or or trying to quickly make a trip to the bathroom outside could be deadly, because you could be spotted and hunted within the space of a few minutes. And on the Ukraine side, because getting to positions and getting back is so deadly. I mean, I remember with my own reporting, I remember back in 2023, when infantry would spend 5 days on positions and then come back for 2 days and then go out for another 5 days. Now it's quite normal to spend weeks out there on positions on the zero line, and infantry actually prefer spending that long out there, because the trip back and forth is so deadly. I've been to the zero line, I think 3 times. The last time was summer last year. So that was, right looking over no man's land, Russians about 150 meters away. But for a journalist, that's impossible at this point. Everyone says, you want to go out there, it's going to be a one-way trip.
Wow.
And that's and you can compare numbers, but it's also a completely different way that infantry experienced and being used on the Ukrainian side compared to the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, they are defending. They're trying to hold these lines, which are sometimes getting thinner and thinner, and it's really tough. And they're spending sometimes weeks on position at once. Whereas again, I was with these Peaky Blinders drone team in early May outside Pokrovsk, and you can see it on the screens, the way the Russians just move forward. They are almost, I understand there are more experienced Russian assault forces. There's Spetsnaz, there's VDV, the air assault troops. But the average Russian infantryman, and I've spoken to them, those who were taken prisoner near Kursk, they just go forward as if they're almost like dead inside. They're almost ready to meet their death already. They just walk forward in wave after wave, small group. Their aim is just to get up the field as fast as they can and dig in, and they're not thinking about much else. And we hear from POWs, we hear from interceptions about the widespread use of blocking forces. So I think it's important, and I have a lot of criticism for the Ukrainian leadership and how sometimes there are consistent issues in the way that they fight their fight that lead to excess infantry casualties, which is the worst thing you can have in a fight for independence and in an attritional war. But at the same time, it's nothing, I think, compared to the way the Russians use it, because they have a very simple equation that if we can recruit 30,000, 50,000 new contract soldiers a month, give them a huge sign-up bonus, then that's that much land we can get in Ukraine for the price of those losses.
Yeah. So that obviously you have a cumulative effect of that, especially with that kind of when you have the Russian side with that kind of even mentality, as much as the number of soldiers that are outnumbering them, but with the firepower on top of that, that's a real problem. And I wonder if you could just kind of summarize something that I saw in one of your videos, what I thought was really, really telling. You were, I think it was in the video on drones you did recently, where you were talking about it, and you actually showed a tactical map of the way the Ukraine side was defending a certain point. I think you used an idea of a certain city, and then you showed over time how there's fewer defensive positions because the density of the Ukraine defenders, there's not enough to go around. And and I think you went from 2023 to current. And I wonder if you could just, for our viewers, just kind of explain what is happening with that, and then we'll get to where that's going next.
Yeah. So again, the manpower problem is the infantry problem, and even in the best brigades, which still for a long time were able to recruit people into their infantry, they have higher standards of training and equipment. Even they're saying, it's tough with infantry at the moment. But there are also other brigades which only get mobilized infantry, which may not have the most resources or the best command. They might have more like Soviet era command, and that's where you'll have issues with motivation as well, and losses. But it's otherwise it's simple mathematics. Unfortunately, if you are fighting with only only 40 or 30% infantry compared to 70 or 80% infantry, that means you have to make sacrifices to hold the same amount of front line. So that means fewer people on each position. That means people on position for longer each time, or potentially a larger distance between positions. And so nowhere in the front line is there a long trench with a guy every 100 feet. It's they're living in small groups on these positions that are dug out, these little strong points. But sometimes there are larger distances between those than you would really want, to the point where the front line becomes quite porous. And then you have the question of the quality of those people, the motivation of those people who are there on those positions, because if they're there for longer and longer, it's maybe questionable how effective they actually will be in a firefight against assaulting Russian infantry. And so that's why, because of this objective fact, Ukraine has had to really go all in on their own drone units, which are scaling up, from company to battalion to regiment, and now entire brigades of drones. And again, it is a huge success story, because it's a very mobile and very professional, mostly coming from volunteer soldiers, very efficient way of being able to move these baseline sources of firepower to any hotspot on the front line, and to quickly blunt the Russian offensive coming forward. And that's what we've seen. Perhaps Ukraine's best drone unit, the Magyar's Birds, when they were deployed to Pokrovsk, that was pretty soon after that. The Pokrovsk front was stabilized. But the same goes on the Russian side, where they bring their best drone units. That's where they have a lot of extra firepower and cause nightmares for Ukrainian logistics. But on that defensive fight for Ukraine, it's well and good to have some of your best drone units defending behind your front line, but the question is, who is actually on the front line?
Well, right. And that's actually what I wanted to ask you next, because one of the videos that Gary has found here recently, there's obviously lots of videos about grabbing people off the street or whatever. Now, here a couple of times there's been what looks like a food delivery guys bring some food and then ends up getting grabbed off the street. That's just one example of a lot of stuff that happens lately. But how is that viewed within Ukraine? Because obviously this is not isolated, and those are the guys presumably that get put up to the line of contact that you were talking about a second ago. How's that affected morale of the troops or even the population inside of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's there's no point running away from this topic. I think at first, when the first videos like this came out, a lot of people were, on one hand you had Russian kind of disinformation pushing it, and then you had the Ukrainians denying that it was happening in the first place and saying this was all Russian disinformation, where this is clearly happening, and people tell stories about it happening to their cousin or their friend or something like that. This is the reality of a country, a democratic country that needs to do forced mobilization into a war that is so deadly. It's always, and I think I mentioned it earlier, it's always going to be, the need to regularly bring, thousands of men to the war against their will. Because the flow of volunteers into the infantry, they're still going into drone units, but the flow of volunteers into the infantry has slowed down. It is a painful thing, and it's painful for me to watch it now. And it's you could ask the question of how it could be done, better, and I think it is exactly this practice, this forced mobilization, that was the biggest source of, and still is the biggest source of criticism towards the government. But at the same time, as and I don't condone what we're seeing now at all, and I think forced mobilization can be done without these violent practices. But on the level of the country as a whole, we're not seeing mass protests against this. We're not seeing, I talked about Zelensky's rating going up because Ukrainians as a whole understand what the alternative is. The alternative is capitulation. The alternative is Russian victory. The alternative is everything that we saw in cities. I was there in Kherson 3 days after liberation in Izium. I was speaking to people who were tortured, to children who were tortured, to parents who had their kids deported. They understand that if the Russians aren't stopped there, then they're coming to your city next. And we see in Kherson now, we see Russian drones hunting civilians on a daily basis, and now there's a big threat of that starting to happen in Sumy, a new regional capital. In Kharkiv, just over the last few weeks, we've seen the first reports of Russian drones starting to fly into those cities. So the forced mobilization, it's there's a lot that's being done wrong with that inside this country. And I think, when it comes to the manpower issue, it's not just about mobilization. It's not just about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you one question on that, and I'm sorry,
Yeah.
we're kind of running short on time. You said you've been to the zero line a few times. Have you run across any of those folks that were forced mobilized, like that were basically captured and taken off the street and then showed up at the front line? And what was their morale compared to anybody just normally recruited?
Yeah, I have. I've seen mobilized troops on training grounds. I've seen them on positions. They've told me that, yep, I got the paper, or people have told me that, yeah, I was stopped by these recruitment officers on the street. I think, but then again, there are volunteer troops who have been in the infantry now for a very long time, and once you're there, they're also quite tired. They're fatigued. They can be deserters as well. It's not a good place to end up in, and it's not a good place to be in for so long. But at the same time, very many mobilized people, they haven't run away. They're still there. They're fighting. They understand that they maybe could if they tried. But the amount of times that I heard that we're fighting the Russians here so that they don't come to my family, even back in Western Ukraine, I've heard that many times.
And just before we let you go here, I'm going to run through some of the stuff we were going to talk about. Like there's Pete Hegseth was at congressional hearings yesterday and today, says that whatever amount of money has been going to Ukraine, it's now going to be sent less. There's going to be a smaller amount of it. And you had a Ukrainian colonel that came to Washington, I guess, a week or so ago, and he admitted that by the fall, they projected that the Ukraine could completely lose the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk, and that perhaps by the next year they could lose everything up to the Dnipro River, which is a pretty substantial issue here. So the question, I guess the last question I want to ask you is, if that is accurate, and that certainly has been the trend for about a year at least, that it's moving in that direction, and because of all the inputs on the Russian side you've very articulately talked about here, it seems like at some point that the Ukraine side would have to say, I know I don't want the Russians to come in, but to have an ugly negotiated settlement on something close to these lines here, the 4 oblasts, would seem to be better than letting the war go on and lose everything up the Dnieper River. Is that conversation happening anywhere in Ukraine?
Well, I think when it comes to those comments from Pavlo Palisa, he was talking about Russia's goal. And we know what Russia's goal is, which has been, again, it started with an attack on Kiev, and then after that failed, it turned into a war of attrition to break the Ukrainian military's ability to defend. But the main goal hasn't changed, but Ukraine has something to say about it. Ukraine has the right to keep fighting, and for a long time still, especially now that they've done so well with drones, they have the ability to keep fighting. And when it comes to the idea of just handing over 4 oblasts, again, we are talking about millions of people it's not about the territory, it's about the people being handed over into a regime of Russian occupation, of widespread torture, of the deportation of children. And again, I've been in the areas that were liberated. For Ukraine, freedom and dignity are really just above all. And there is, for now, I can't say what it will be like because in 6 months, because if we do reach a state of collapse, obviously that completely changes the calculus. But for now, obviously, things like US aid being cut off, they do have their cost in territory and lives. And, we could see some really scary scenarios, especially with drones starting to fly into places like Sumy or Kharkiv. But the idea of capitulation, to the extent that new territories that Russia hasn't even captured would be handed over into that regime, which just wants to destroy everything Ukrainian, it's not on anyone's mind at the moment.
I see. All right. Well, we appreciate you're coming on the show today and give us some insight into how things are viewed from the Ukraine side. This really, really does help a lot. And I, on behalf of our audience, I really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you very much.
No worries. Happy to share.
And thank you guys very much. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we will be coming back to you with some more new episodes of Daniel Davis Deep Dive tomorrow. See you then.